That being said, it's my opportunity now to introduce our first keynote speaker. Our first speaker is Shannon McDonald. Shannon is the Atlantic Practicing Manager Partner for Deloitte, overseeing Deloitte's marketplace presence in Atlantic Canada. For the past 2 years, Shannon was a member of the firm's board of directors and is now a member of the executive team. Her most recent achievement includes one of Canada's most powerful women, Top 100 Award by the Women's Executive Network, and one of Atlantic Canada's top 50 CEOs. Her experience includes over 20 years of public accounting and consulting services. Shannon chairs the capital campaign for the Canadian Cancer Society, Nova Scotia Division, as well as sits on the boards of Greater Halifax Partnership and the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council, and on the Finance Committee of Women's College Hospital Board, Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Shannon to the microphone.
There we go. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk to you about productivity. So I'm hoping that perhaps I can help generate a few ideas to kick things off. And as I look at your objectives for the day, I do firmly believe that there is a role for all, not only Nova Scotians, but Atlantic Canadians to improve economic activity, and certainly understanding productivity is helpful in doing that. So I'm really excited by the objectives you have today, and hopefully will help to contribute to those. So just to give you a little background on the productivity topic and why I'm speaking to it, Deloitte, being a firm with lots of consultants and smart people floating around, love to study and research things. And so sometimes we do that when clients ask us to, and sometimes we do that just because. And on the topic of productivity, we did it just because. And last year in September, our study concluded in this is the abbreviated report, but there's a large document which is on our website called an 8-step game plan for Canada. And then that led to some questions which made us do a second study, and the second one, again, future of productivity, clear choices for a competitive Canada. And so I'll talk to you a bit about the findings that we have there and tell some stories around what I've observed around Atlantic Canada on this topic. So to start at the beginning, productivity is a combination of a few economic variables. There's employment rates, work effort, and productivity, which all lead to standard of living or GDP type calculations. And so when we look at our standard of living, we look at employment rates, and actually in Canada, our employment rates are pretty similar to other countries. And this study focuses a lot on comparing us to the US. So we hold our own. We also hold our own in work effort. So the number of hours we put into our workday is also consistent. So when we talk about productivity, we're certainly not talking about working harder, because we work hard enough. What we're talking about is what is the output for the work we do. And so when we looked at standard of living and looked at the thing that really holds us back, productivity holds us back. So how does it hold us back? If you look at where we were in 1981, we were pretty close to the US in terms of our productivity measure. But over time, as we get to, and this graph ends at 2008, you see the gap widening, so that at the end of this period of time, there's actually a $13 an hour gap, or 17% gap, between Canada's GDP per hour and the US GDP per hour. So why is that? And as we did the study last year and came up with 8 ideas for how to improve productivity, we had a lot of dialogue across Canada around, well, what about, and what about, and what about? So what about size? Is Canada just, smaller with smaller companies, and therefore we just would never be as productive as the US? Or is it our sector composition? Because we have a lot of resource-based economic activity in Canada. So whether that be forestry or oil and gas, or is that making a difference? And the answers to both of those in this year's study were no, actually that's not the factor. Growth is the factor. So what makes a productive economy and gets at that output that you want, that increasing output, is an environment where companies are growing. And what I'll get to over this talk is that in order for us to get to an environment of growing companies, we need a lot of partnerships and a lot of collaborations. So business has to take the lead and get out there and take some risk and do some stuff, but they absolutely have to collaborate with all sorts of government support as well as academic support. So the academic community, the government community, and the business community, all working together, can actually get to an environment that creates more productive type of commerce. And productive means growing, vibrant. So, you know, everyone wants to be part of a growing, vibrant something. And it doesn't really matter the size of the place that you are. So rural Canada, urban Canada, Atlantic Canada, Western Canada. If you can get into an environment that's growing, you'll see that the things that are needed to create a more productive economy are there. So just to get a little bit more into the dispelling the myths. So the first myth I mentioned to you was around the size of companies. So we sort of compared different sizes of companies to their counterparts in the US and said, so is it that we have more small companies or that small companies really make a difference in this? And no, there wasn't. The light blue, I'm not sure with the lighting if you can see some of the details here, but there's a light blue on the right-hand side. Light blue, dark blue. Light blue's Canada, dark blue's US. You know, if you're 1 to 500 person employees, 500 plus in all firms, you can see the variation is very similar across all those categories. So what we concluded was that 2% of the gap does come from having a composition of companies that are smaller, but that wasn't really big enough to accept that as a rationale for being less productive. The other one we looked more closely at was the resource intensity. So again, reconciling from US productivity growth over to Canadian productivity growth, this large piece was in sector. So you compare sector to sector, we were less productive on all sectors. So only 6%, again, of the total variation can be attributed to the fact that we're a different sector composition. So again, 6% wasn't really a big enough variation, so we said, okay, let's get at the real reason. And that led us to growth. And so if you look at, this is companies with employees under 20, 20 to 500, and over 500. Light blue is high growth companies, dark blue is low growth companies. And you can see that high growth companies in all sizes do achieve a significant more output. So their productivity is much higher. So if they're growing, what are they doing? What does it look like? And it's because they're investing and they're creating, they're probably a bit more competitive. They have behavior that makes them more productive. The growth sort of is a sign of the type of activity that you would do and end up with a more productive company. It's a little less impactful for companies under 20. You certainly see a big difference when companies grow past 20. But nonetheless, it's a factor on all sizes of companies. So this graph shows, the first is share of firms, and the second one is share of new jobs created. And with the dark blue, you'll see for firms, first by employment rate, then by revenue growth, 5% of the firms create 43% of the new jobs. 7% of the firms create 41% of the revenue generated. So again, the impact that those high growth firms are having on revenue and jobs is quite significant. And the ones that are not high growth can actually have negative impacts on those sorts of measures. Again, comparing by size of firm, you can see that there's very little distinction between Canada and the US. So this chart compares Canada and the US. And there's 5 size categories, and we blew up the last 2 because they're so little, just blew them up here. And again, very similar in that, you know, the distribution of the companies there. So on this one, here's another interesting slice. This is how long a company has been around. So if you are a firm that's under 5 years versus a firm that's been around for more than 5 years, you are more likely in Canada to be high growth in the first 5 years. And then after 5 years, for some reason, we tend to level off. So in this graph, you'll see Canada, percentage of high growth firms under 5 years, Canada's right up there after Spain and the Netherlands. Once we go over 5 years old, we drop down to the end of that chart. So we place lower. So interestingly, I think there's a characteristic of sometimes companies that perhaps are more lifestyle companies. So you start a company, and when you yourself are comfortable with the living you have, you may be inclined to level set. And also there may be rationale that there's not incentives for growth. Maybe the tax incentives or other things that are out there aren't incenting you to grow. But whatever the rationale for that, there is a leveling off on growth. But remember, if you keep growing, you do impact productivity. So again, these are decisions individuals are making, and you can't, that's fine. Every individual can make their own decision about how they want to run their life and their business and all of that. But if we as a collective group have an economic concern, then we want to motivate individuals to actually keep going and keep growing, because the spill-off effect for everybody around being close to and part of growing companies is significant. So why is it that we're not really growing at rates of other countries, or why is it that we wouldn't keep growing after that 5-year mark? So 3 things that we have found to be characteristic of the Canadian business population is that they, pardon my generalizations, but they lack competitive intensity, they lack trade activity, and the business attitude is fairly low risk. So when you combine all those things, you tend to see businesses who don't invest as much, don't export as much, and therefore you don't see some of the spill-off effects. So I'll get into some of the factors affecting growth, and I'm happy to take questions if at any point through some of these pieces of data that you wanted any clarifications. So when we did this version this year, we decided to look a little more carefully at sectors. We said, okay, so let's see some of the behavior within each of the sectors and what are the lessons learned from them. So manufacturing was one sector we looked at more closely. And this chart shows, sort of compares Canada and the US. And on the second chart, on the second side, we're measuring labor cost per unit of output. And you can see we were very similar through the 1990 to 2000. But you start to see the dollar cost change, and of course the dollar value changed. And the US became much more efficient. So that the US goes down in terms of labor cost per unit of output, and Canada goes up significantly. So you start to see a huge gap. Some of that is the dollar, and some of that is certainly investments in equipment and capital. So US companies, even through the recession, continued to invest in their equipment, and Canada shows a lower tendency towards that type of investment. So as a result, on the manufacturing stage over the last decade, Canada has gotten to more of a disadvantage because of their labor cost per unit. So they're not as competitive. So that's something to consider in manufacturing. In retail, this chart shows entry points. So we're measuring the Canadian productivity on the line graph. And there's points in time where certain competitors joined the Canadian market. So Walmart came into the Canadian market. Home Depot, Eaton's was purchased, Best Buy arrived, Apple came on scene, sale of HBC. What was interesting in retail, and retail actually becomes a very good news story, because as we look at retail, we see that the winners in retail, so if you look at Shoppers Drug Mart, Mark's Work Wearhouse, trying to think of, yes, Canadian Tire's another one. They fought back. Indigo Chapters, when competitors came into the Canadian market and they had more sophisticated retail, more IT, they made shopping a different kind of experience. There was online shopping. The Canadian retailers who fought back on that and fought back on and became competitive with the standards that these big companies were bringing in, they succeeded. So we actually see a better productivity outcome happen in retail. Now, if you dig into retail, of course, a lot of people opted out of the retail sector. So a lot of businesses did go under, and we lost a lot of retailers across Canada. But the ones that got the competitive piece and invested back in and fought back kept the Canadian consumers, and actually in that process became more productive and therefore have a great impact on the economy. So that is one where responding to competition showed that they created better productivity, and competition, while it was painful, wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The other characteristic of Canadian companies is export. We are low exporters. Now, this is an index. So if you are a non-exporter, you're at 96% on a productivity index. So you're below the 100% target. If you're a new entrant to export, you're 103%. And if you're a continuing exporter, you're at 129%. So basically that says the continuing exporters have a much higher productivity index. Some statistics from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, similar type of numbers, so I'll just use one set of numbers, but they're about the same type of comparative. 22,000 companies registered in either of those two provinces. 22,800 of them actually are registered as exporters. So that's a very low percentage of companies in our provinces that export. But you look at our population, and even if you take a maritime slice of the population, we're not even hitting 2 million people. So you can't really create a highly productive economy based on, let's say, a service-oriented business environment or even a manufacturing environment that sells only to 2 million people. So maritime Canada, even more so than Canada, really does need to consider the export environment, because if we can create an environment for business that allows them to easily export and understand export markets and share learnings, because we have some very successful companies who do that. Acadian Sea Plants has huge amounts of export. Everything that Ocean Nutrition was doing was export. They only had a couple of Canadian clients even, forget about Atlantic Canada. They were all exporting, and they've all grown significantly because of that. So we can learn. We absolutely have business mentors to help other companies come through and export. We have a lot of programs that help understand foreign markets. So that's a huge opportunity and leverage point for us. Some statistics, though, on how we're doing as a Canadian market in export. Breaking the population down between companies with less than 250 employees and more than 250 employees. And this is export value by firm. Canada, the dark line, is quite low in both, particularly low in the less than 250 employees, which would be the group we would be focused here in, more so in Atlantic Canada. So the values and the intensity of export is low. If you look at free trade agreements, so again, this is sort of looking to government to say, how can you help support us in business? And you know, Canada has such a great reputation for being an open country and an open environment, yet the total free trade agreements is 10. You know, Chile has 52, Mexico has 44, Brazil has 19. So that's an interesting piece. And then here, merchandise covered by free trade agreements dropped 9% between 2000 and 2008. So I'm not sure that we've done our work on creating a trade environment that really does enable as much export as we would like to see. And then, again, dependency on the US has led us to perhaps not depend on other countries for our export. So because we're very dependent on the US, Canada has only 4 trade agreements with developing countries, and percentage of exports to developing countries is only 13.6. So we haven't looked at that as a export potential as much as perhaps we should. The other thing I mentioned in terms of a thing that holds us back is our business attitude. And we did a study where we interviewed 500 American business owners, and 500 Canadian business owners. And we asked them about their attitudes towards risk. So it's interesting, about half of the US business owners said, we're very risk averse, and half said, we're risk takers. We went to the Canadian market and half said, we're risk averse, and the other half said, we're risk takers. So we said, okay, well, that's interesting, because there doesn't seem to be a difference. But we took that and we mapped it to their behavior. And in the US, risk-averse business owners and risk-taking business owners actually look pretty similar. It's just their perception of how they approach business. In the US, there is an acceptance to trying and failing. You see a lot of people perhaps have a few business failures before they have a business success. It's considered a bit more of a badge of honor. And there's a lot more investor opportunity, so they can get access to money to invest in their ideas. And if it fails, they just pick themselves up, they try again, they invest in another one. In Canada, we're not, it's not a badge of honor, and maybe it will get there, but right now it's, you don't want to do it unless you really think you can succeed, because we're a bit tough on our failures. And we don't have as much access to investment capital as easily. So this chart on the right side compares this behavior in an index. So 47 for rating for Canadians, 57 for Americans. So we did see that we are a risk-averse culture. The chart on the left shows lifestyle businesses versus growth-oriented businesses. So we do have 57 versus 43% of our businesses who do, as I mentioned earlier, operate for lifestyle. Like they really just want to create a business so that their family has an income, a good living, and that's their goal. That's it. And again, that's great, and a lot of people that we know do that. If in the collective group of us, though, we want to see more growth-oriented businesses, we do have to think about what incents people to be in the 43% of growth-oriented businesses if following that path is difficult. So risk aversion creates other behaviors. One of the things that people do tend to shy away from if they're risk averse is heavy investment. And highly productive companies do have lots of investment in research and development, in information technology, and in equipment. And we see low investments in those areas in Canadian companies. We see investment in research and development in Canadian companies mostly if there's the government incentive attracts people towards doing that, whereas the American business tends to invest in research and development just because. So we're not quite there. This index compares Canada to the US. It compares 2000 to 2010. Got to get closer so I can see you guys will never be able to read it. I can't read it from up here, so anyways, you can have these slides after. But 2000 to 2008, the investment is shown there on the graph on the left. And you can see between 2000 and 2008, we have increased our investment. The first one is oil and gas, then manufacturing, then financial services, and then retail. Only retail after 2010, where you see it going over that dotted line, only retail in 2010 exceeds the average investment in the US. So the dotted line represents what U.S. tends to invest in businesses regardless of the sector. Oil and gas, manufacturing, financial services all fall below. Retail, they got in the game. And as I mentioned before, they have great results because of that. Total risk capital as a percentage of GDP, Canada falls near the bottom of the chart, if you see the chart on the right-hand side. So those are the factors and the analysis behind the work we did. And you know, there's lots of examples of successful businesses in Atlantic Canada. And what's interesting is if we look at what would create a highly productive economy, so and we've done some looking at different communities in the US and compared to our community, and our community being sort of the greater, whether it be the province or the region. And interestingly, if you compare it to a recipe, we have all the ingredients. We're just sort of missing the right chef to cook it up. And the right chef is us, and I think it's us working collaboratively together. That's the secret sauce. Because the ingredients are talent, and we've got amazing talent coming out of universities, amazing talent in our workforce, and we all know people who have moved away and would move back, you know, with the right opportunity. So there's great talent here. You know, we have mentors, we have people who have had successful businesses, have had successful high growth and exporting businesses who can help. And we have actually very strong government programs. When people from other countries come here to look at Canada, they see the government programs we have, whether they be from ACOA or from provincial governments or any of the incentives around, and they go, these are great programs. The difference in their attitude, and I find this fascinating when I hear them talk about our programs, a lot of us, and I'm an Atlantic Canadian, so I'll say us, we sometimes see the grant and we think, great, I got the grant, so I'm done. And the people from other countries see the grant and they go, great, I can get started. Because to them, the grant is the leverage money they need to get the additional private capital investment and to get the bigger slice of the pie. And so that slight behavior or lens change to that opportunity makes a huge difference in being a lifestyle business versus a high growth business. When you see the incentives available to you and you know how you can leverage it, that's when that little change in attitude can make a big difference. So I'll show you the recommendations on the following slide, but I did want to point out that how the recommendations apply or how you apply them to any particular business does depend on the business life cycle. So there's pioneering businesses, growing, mature, and declining businesses. And sometimes declining businesses, you have to decide whether you're going to decline and exit or you're going to return to pioneering, because every industry, every business goes through this cycle. And at the end of the cycle, we have to decide we're going to let it die or we're going to come back. And when we come back, you've got to go back to, you know, deciding how you're going to reinvent. So, you know, creation of ideas, reinvention, all of that stuff has to keep being generated and retried in business. So it's never over, really. You just kind of have to keep starting. And some businesses in the high tech, for example, might go through this cycle in a year, a half a year. Some other industries that we know and love may take 50 years to go through that. But that's an important consideration as you think of what recommendations you want to do going forward. So what we did when we looked at this kind of larger economic problem is we said, absolutely, the partnering and the collaboration is important. And as a business community, we looked at ourselves and we're tough on ourselves and said, often we turn to government and say, this is the problem, will you guys fix it? But actually our view on this is that business needs to lead this. Business needs to have the attitude and the incentive and the desire to lead it. But they can't go alone. They absolutely need to collaborate with government and academia. And that partnership, that three-party partnership, has been very important throughout both of our studies. So just sort of getting into some of the details around the recommendations. Business, we said to business, we think that you need to get into trade more. So you do need to explore this export notion. Talent's important, so make sure you're investing what you need to invest in talent programs and attracting talent. Investment, again, is important. So whether that be capital, equipment, or information technology, you know, a growing business does need to keep investing in those areas. So what can you do to invest? Clusters. So clustering, and I think that's a really interesting opportunity for Atlantic Canada. We've visited different clusters across the country, and there's one in Waterloo that we particularly think applies here. And that is one where it's called Communitech. And there's a lot of partners to this clustering, and it was created by business to sort of say, we're, you know, at that point in time, 15 years ago, Kitchener-Waterloo was sort of on a decline economically. But they've bounced back over those 15 years based on a cluster concept that happened in their environment. So they have key anchor tenants like RIM, the universities there. There's a lot of other big business that sits in Kitchener-Waterloo that are members. And there's some fantastic government programs that have been directed to Communitech. And as a result, they've achieved their goal of an entrepreneur a day. So they create from this location, this hub location, an environment where people can come in, try their ideas. So if I want to work on an app, I can go talk to RIM, or I can talk to different, you know, large tech companies who sit there, right there in front of me, and I can say, will this work with you guys? You know, will this work on the BlackBerry? Or I can go to bank, the banks are right there, I can ask them about financing, or the government's there, and so this environment helps me to navigate. So as an idea person, I can navigate the business world to turn my idea into a business. And as a result, all these students coming out of these universities with great ideas are turning them into business. And interestingly, I hear lots of comments about RIM and is it, you know, not so successful. But regardless of what RIM as a business has done for its own success, it has contributed an amazing amount of success to the community of Kitchener-Waterloo in the economic spin-out that it's done by investing in this next generation. And the next generation business owners there have gone and come back. They have a real sense of gratitude to that hub that kind of launched them. So they do come back and mentor. They put money back into it. And so it's a real thriving environment. We did an economic study comparing Kitchener-Waterloo to London, Ontario, and Windsor, Ontario. And over the last 15 years, Kitchener-Waterloo has doubled in its average income per household. The number of people employed has doubled. Like all the economic statistics that you'd look at around employment and wealth have really jumped. And in London and Windsor, they have not. And you know, these are cities that are quite comparable in terms of geography and you know, all other things. So that hub concept really did make a difference. And when you look at where they were when they started, they were definitely no better off than we are. And interestingly, they would say, we're way better off to start because even just our environment and our way of life and our playground that we have makes us even that much more attractive. Because as they would say, we're kind of nowhere. We have no mountains, we don't have ocean, we don't have anything that would attract people to come here. And certainly there's other urban centers just an hour or so away. Why are they coming here? Well, they're coming here because of this environment and helpfulness and sort of optimism that these young people can kind of hang out with each other and get somewhere. So clustering is an important concept. And I think there's a lot of talk actually here now around clustering, and so hopefully we'll see some activity around that. And then we have that whole reinvention piece. So you can't ever feel like you're done. So sort of a message to business to say, have environments where you really are innovative and reinventing. We went to government and we said, where you can expand trade inflows and outflows, that would be a huge help to the productivity challenge. Immigration, we really do need to continue to bring immigrant well, people to our population for a number of reasons. They have a great attitude about business startup, and we need the additional workforce to help with it. So including immigration is very important. Having incentives for growth rather than being small. So there's incentives to get started, but are there enough incentives to grow? And we would like to see government focused on that. And foreign direct investment. So again, we do seem to have less access to investors. So let's open our business environment to foreign investment. And decision making based on facts. And that's just sort of, you know, if we can use the data available to us, you know, there's a lot of decisions that we can make that would be fact-based, that would help. And the last group is academics. And I've certainly seen a lot more activity in this area in Atlantic Canada, even in the last year, and it's really exciting. And these two ideas are commercialization and curriculum. So we got amazing collection of universities in Atlantic Canada with a ton of smart people creating new ideas every day. And unfortunately, because of the nature of that group and the environment they're in, it tends to sit on shelves. And so how do you get all those great ideas out into a commercialized state and have them in the business environment, have them being exported? These are world-class ideas. These are world-class brains working in all of our universities, very close to all of our communities. And what can we do as a government and business community to partner with them to get that happening? And there's a few challenges. There's intellectual property challenges. There's investment challenges. But a lot more activity now around that. And so I think if you went into Dalhousie or UNB or different universities now, you would start to see this being talked about. And the other place where this needs to happen is in our health authorities. Lots of great research happening in our health authorities that, again, we haven't really been incentivized to commercialize. So let's take all that fabulous brain power, which we do have, and look at that concept. And curriculum is starting to happen too. I'm seeing classroom environments, and I've been invited in to either observe them or talk to them, and it's really quite fun what's happening. And this wasn't happening when I was in university. Business students hanging out with, working with, projecting with, engineering students, science students, the idea schools. And you know, I think in business, I'm a business student, and I think business students tend to gravitate to service because we're not, like my brain's never been programmed to wonder how that projector's working or how the sound's being transmitted through this mic. But I'm interested in business and service and that sort of thing. So how do you match up those people, process-focused, marketing-focused type business people with the idea brains? And the best place to do that would be right in the universities to get people thinking and collaborating that way. And so there are now emerging programs which are considered entrepreneurial programs that get those people working in teams in the university sector. So at a table like you're at in a classroom setting, there could be a couple of engineers, marketing person, general business person, and maybe a scientist, and they're working together on a real idea, and their classroom time is not spent being lectured to on it. Their classroom time is spent understanding the consumer profile for their idea, testing the consumer profile, actually turning it into a business. And I talked to some of these students, and I said, how does your team operate? What's it like? And they said, well, it's really neat because, I guess these were two IT guys, and so he's like, me and my buddy, we sit down and we come up with these ideas at this side of the table, and we're all excited about whatever we're developing. And meanwhile, our other two partners sort of look at the marketing and business side, and then we come back together. And sure enough, they've got different opinions on what our great idea can do, but what they love is that they're getting that almost resistance and contradiction at really early stages. And so they're able to adapt their idea and retest their idea as it's in progress, as opposed to at the end and find out, well, it's not really actually it's a good idea, but nobody wants to buy it. So listening to these students and how excited they are is really wonderful. And then, if you take that So here's real life sort of trail through this. If you take curriculum and you have, and this is what's actually really happening in Atlantic Canada right now, there's a course that's called Lean Startup at Dalhousie, and it's the first time this course is being run, and it's based on people who went to visit places like Communitech. Some professors went there, got inspired, and said, we gotta start somewhere. So they have this course. They've only allowed 36 students into it, so there's scientists, engineers, IT students, and some business students, and they're teamed up in project teams. And then those teams can go to, there's another group that's called Propel ICT, which is an accelerator in New Brunswick. And Propel ICT has opened up to be more maritime and has said, okay, let's see where some emerging ideas are. And they take 10 companies on a year, and they help to accelerate their progress. If their idea is good, they will give you the environment to get you investor ready. And when they did their sort of panel to pick the 10 companies this year, 2 of those 10 came from that Lean Startup class at Dalhousie. And those kids have only been working on their idea for 2 months, because this just happened in the last month. So they started September, October, they've been working as teams. They went up against other pre-investor ready companies, and 2, like 10 of the 10 spots, 2 of them are taken by these students. And the feedback from the accelerator group was those 2 teams were actually head and shoulders above the other 8. The caliber of their business readiness and the way they propose their idea, they've already got an idea that's so much better thought out than the other teams. And so when they have 20 judges, and those 2 teams were the only 2 teams that 20 judges all unanimously said, yeah, that one, and then the other spots they debated a little bit about and gave them out. And so now you see, this is probably the 3rd year that Propel ICT is taking these 10 companies through to get them investor ready. Every year that we're doing this, we're getting better and better at it. And it's because more parties are coming to the table with their expertise. So now you see academia coming to the table of what business is trying to do and bringing stronger students, stronger ideas, because they're getting the process. And same thing, I think, you see a COA, as an example, they're looking at how to help and support these ideas as they're ready for investors, and they're coming across more and more ideas and more investor matching than was happening before, because it was harder to find the private sector money before. But the private sector money is starting to come out again. And if the private sector money is not there to invest, the government programs can't do it on their own. So it's interesting, the seeds are there, it's starting, and as each party comes to this, it just seems to make it stronger and stronger. And so what we'll see is, I hope, something like the Communitech story, where 15 years from now, we're gonna look at the economic measures and we're gonna say, wow, we really started to do things differently back then, and now our economic statistics compared to prairies or another country, another region, are different as a result. So that's sort of what I hope to see, and I'm really excited because even in the last year, I'm starting to see a lot more of it. So that's kind of neat, and it's happening right around us. So I'm going to stop there because I would love to hear some ideas from you. I might not have all the answers, and if you have any questions that are too economics focused, I'm going to make Fred answer them. Yeah, sure.
Technical team back there to let you know that we have 75 people on the webcast. So if you have a question, if you would go to the microphone and ask your question, please. That's the only way that the webcast will pick up your questions.
Oh, I think I turned that off, sorry.
As a manager of a CBDC in Yarmouth, basically our role is to support small business by providing loans. When I think in terms of Yarmouth, my community, I think in terms of the aging business population, when you were talking about growth and high growth being within the first 5 years of business, then it has a tendency to drop off. Just a general observation I've seen is that, you know, when people first get into business, as I say, they want to grow the business, and particularly when they get older and they're starting to think in terms of, you know, retirement, and I don't think businesses often think about succession planning soon enough. They get to the point where they're sort of guarding their business, so they have high growth. But then, how do you see demographics impacting business growth here in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, it's kind of back to that life cycle, I guess, of at some point you have to allow some things to die off, and some people will own their businesses and they will close them at the end of their life, and then some of them will sell them at the end of their life. And it is much easier to sell if it's in a growth state. So if it is, you know, on decline, you're probably not going to sell it. So you have to, I guess, go a bit more macro on that and think about how do I attract those young people who are creating the new businesses? And if you can create an environment, a community where they will want to come and start their business, that's a great opportunity. And again, if you have like a Yarmouth where potentially there's a declining population at this point, that's where export can really be an opportunity. And what's great about the information technology sector is we don't have to worry as much about logistics and movement of goods. So you can have a sector that's not based on or limited by a remote location. So I think the opportunity to really look at some of those sectors and some of those young people and think about what would really attract them. You know, HB Studios is close by, and that's a fantastic technology-based industry that does very well in a small town, and it attracts people to work there because they love being part of a young, dynamic group of people creating something new, working on games, and they love it. And so, you know, I think finding that would be part of it, I guess. I don't know if anyone has any other ideas. I'm happy to take those. Yes.
Certainly don't have an idea on that one. Donna Hatt with White Point Beach Resort. Working in rural communities and trying to grow the smaller operators, the mom and pops, the ones that have incredible assets, are so preoccupied with just trying to stay afloat and operating. The challenge becomes in growing the market readiness, making the connections beyond where they are presently. While the Waterloo example is interesting, have you got something from a more remote rural example where market readiness and collaboration, and certainly speaking to the business collaboration, the clustering, we're working through all of that, and we're seeing success in some of the rural communities. But I think it continues to be a challenge to look at the market readiness long before the export becomes part of that opportunity.
Right, right. What I find interesting is in my travels around maritime Canada and Atlantic Canada, how many fascinating businesses I find in very small towns. And I keep getting surprised. So that's interesting because I kind of think, yeah, I've covered Atlantic Canada pretty well, and then I go into another town and I meet another company and I think, wow. Now, how do we get more of those? Because, you know, I had a tour of Oxford Foods. Like, that's an amazing story that just started from picking blueberries, and some questions, basically very inquisitive minds asked Because as they sat around the table with these businesses, and they said, I spoke to them, I just came to Nova Scotia as a favor to my friend here. Like, I didn't expect anything was going to happen because I just thought, well, I'll come and mentor these businesses. They sat at the table with Nova Scotia startups and said, I'm in. Had no intent, I didn't come here with cash, but now that I see what you're doing, I'm in. So that's really fascinating. We got great stuff happening. And Newfoundland has just started something similar. So they're going to start a mentor camp. And what their camp is going to be called, I think there's a term being thrown around, Newfound Ocean. So it's back to the ocean sector, and again, looking at how do I get some businesses created out of an ocean sector and, you know, leverage intelligence around the world, because it's a global economy and we do want to export. So that whole cycle needs to be encouraged, and we need to be open to that. So that's the conclusion of my stories for this morning. So thank you very much. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon. I understand your slides will be made available to folks. Is that correct, Shannon? Okay.